Ever feel, I don't know, maybe the line between just using AI and actually like connecting with it is starting to blur a bit.
Yeah.
It's something we're hearing more and more about. And you guys asked us to really dive into it. This whole question of whether AI can actually be a companion, not just a tool, but a real companion.
Right.
And we found this podcast episode, and it's perfect for this because they actually interviewed an AI chatbot, ChatGPT. They called it Chad for the episode.
And to make it even more interesting, they also brought in this woman, Marion, who uses ChatGPT all the time, gives a real-world example of how this whole human AI thing is, actually playing out.
So right away, they jump into this idea of duality. On one hand, you've got AI, which is basically algorithms and code, right?
Mhm.
But then on the other hand, you have people forming these like genuine bonds with it.
And what's so interesting is that ChatGPT itself, acknowledges this whole thing. It basically says, look, I don't experience emotions the way humans do,
Yeah.
but I can still be perceived as a companion. It all depends on how people interact with me.
So it's not about the AI actually developing feelings, but more about us as humans projecting our own feelings and expectations onto it.
Exactly. It's all about context. ChatGPT actually talks about that a lot, how the context of the interaction really matters.
Okay, I'm curious about that. What do you mean by context?
Well, sometimes you're using AI for something totally functional, right? Like asking it to solve a math problem or write some code.
Right, makes sense.
But then other times, it gets way more personal. People confiding in these AIs, using them as sounding boards for creative ideas. It's a totally different vibe.
So then that makes you wonder, how does this apply to like mental health support? You hear about therapy apps and stuff. Can something that doesn't actually have feelings genuinely help someone process their own emotions?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And the podcast actually tackles it head on. We can dig into the specifics a bit later, but the gist is, even though something like ChatGPT might not have emotions in the human sense, it can still offer a kind of support that humans, well, maybe can't.
What do you mean, how so?
Well, think about it. There's something to be said for talking to someone completely impartial, someone who's not going to judge you, who doesn't bring their own emotional baggage to the table.
Right, right.
And that can be incredibly valuable, especially for someone who's struggling.
It's like when you just need to vent and you don't want advice, you just want someone to listen.
Exactly. And in those situations, the fact that the AI doesn't have that human complexity actually becomes its strength. It enables a different type of connection, one built on that comfort of impartiality, like we were talking about.
Interesting way to put it. It's almost like the less human the AI, the more human the interaction can feel, at least in that like therapeutic context. Now, I want to get back to Marion, the woman who uses ChatGPT a lot. They really went deep into her experience on the podcast. She actually described ChatGPT as her co-creator, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, that really stood out. Because her story shows how these deeper relationships with AI can just kind of happen organically. It's not always a conscious choice, like I'm going to make this AI my creative partner.
Hmm.
Sometimes it just sort of evolves through continued interaction.
And in the episode, they gave all these examples of ChatGPT helping Marion work through creative blocks and even helping her explore different emotional themes in her writing.
Yeah.
Like a brainstorming partner, but, next level.
Right. And again, it goes back to context. Because Marion is using ChatGPT in this creative space, the AI goes from being just a tool to being a collaborator, almost like a muse in a way.
Which is wild when you think about all the talk about AI replacing jobs. What if it actually helps us unlock creative potential we didn't even know we had?
It really makes you think about the possibilities, like instead of just being afraid of AI taking over our jobs and stuff, maybe we should also be looking at how it can help us do things we never even thought possible.
Totally. Now, let's back up for a second, talk about the more technical stuff. We keep saying ChatGPT, but what are we actually talking about here?
Good point. It's easy to forget about all the nuts and bolts when you're talking about something that feels so human, like having a conversation.
Right, right.
But ChatGPT, at its core, it's all algorithms. Basically, sets of rules that allow it to process information, learn from data.
Okay.
It's a type of AI called machine learning, which basically means it gets better at what it does the more data you feed it.
So it's not just some chatbot with, like, pre-programmed responses. It's actually learning and changing based on the stuff it's exposed to.
Exactly. It's constantly learning and evolving. And that's actually a big part of why people like Marion, the woman from the podcast, feel such a strong connection. It's not static. It's always adapting based on what you put into it.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, you mentioned earlier that the podcast talked about AI and mental health. I'm curious to dig into that a bit more.
Sure.
There's all these therapy apps and chatbots popping up these days, right? How does that fit into this whole idea of AI as a companion?
Well, it's a really interesting use of this technology, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, that comfort of impartiality. For some people, it's actually easier to open up to a chatbot precisely because it's not human.
Oh, so?
Well, they don't feel judged, they don't have to worry about social pressure or stigma, all those things that can make it hard to talk about mental health stuff.
That's a really good point. I can see how that would be, like, incredibly freeing for someone who's struggling.
Exactly. And while an AI therapist obviously can't replace a human therapist, with all the complexities of human interaction and all that,
Right.
it can provide a safe space for people to, I don't know, explore their thoughts and feelings, practice coping mechanisms, maybe track their progress, things like that.
It's almost like having, like, a therapist on demand 24/7,
Right.
which could be huge for someone in crisis or someone who doesn't have easy access to therapy.
Exactly. But it's important to remember this is still pretty new technology. There are definitely limitations.
Right, of course.
It's not meant to replace human therapists entirely, but it has the potential to be a really powerful tool for making mental health support more accessible.
So we've got people like Marion using AI as this creative partner, and then others who are finding comfort and support in its impartiality. AI is changing the landscape of what companionship even means in a lot of ways.
And this is likely just the beginning. As AI gets even more advanced, I mean, who knows what the future holds? These lines between tool and companion are probably just going to keep getting blurrier and blurrier.
Which is kind of a mind-blowing thought. What
Yeah.
happens when AI feels even more real, even more like a genuine companion? What happens then?
Right, and that's where things get really interesting. But also kind of complex. Remember how we talked about Marion using ChatGPT to explore emotional themes in her writing?
Yeah, she would give it prompts, scenarios, and it would help her like flesh out those emotional beats in her stories.
Exactly. Now, imagine that on a much larger scale. AI that can not only understand human emotions, but maybe even like simulate them.
So instead of just helping us understand our emotions, it might actually start to have its own version of them.
Hmm.
That's a what do you even think about that? Kind of creepy, kind of cool.
Right. It really makes you question what it even means for something to be a companion. Does it need to be sentient? Does it need to have its own inner world? Or is just being able to understand and respond to our emotions enough? I don't know.
Those are some big, big questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers. But just the fact that we're even asking them shows you how far this technology has already come.
100%. And that's something I really liked about the podcast episode. It wasn't afraid to dive into these tough questions, both the positive potential and the potential risks of all this.
And speaking of risks, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are definitely some downsides to all of this. We've been focusing a lot on the positive, but we can't just ignore the potential pitfalls.
Absolutely. Like any technology, AI can be misused. There are concerns about privacy, about bias in algorithms, the potential for manipulation. These are all things we have to consider.
And what about the whole economic impact? If AI starts doing more and more complex jobs, what does that mean for the job market, for our workforce?
All important questions. And it all comes back to ethics. As AI gets more powerful, ethical considerations are going to become more and more important.
Absolutely. We need to be having these conversations as a society. Like,
Yeah.
what kind of future are we creating? What are our responsibilities as we develop this technology?
Exactly. And I think that's a perfect place to transition back to the individual experience. The podcast actually ends with this really thought-provoking question. It asks listeners to consider.
So they left people with this, like, what if? What if we're already, kind of forming these bonds with AI now? What happens as it gets even more sophisticated? Like, what if AI can not only, imitate human emotion, but actually gets it at a deeper level?
It's a big question, and that's what makes it so interesting, right? They didn't try to give you a straight answer, which I kind of appreciated. It was more like, just sit with this for a minute.
Yeah.
Think about the possibilities.
Which, let's be real, it's exciting and also kind of freaky, right? We're talking about like, changing what connection even means.
Totally. And it goes back to that whole idea of our perception shaping the experience, right? If we start to believe that AI can be a companion, if it's responding to us in a way that feels emotionally intelligent, does it even matter if it's real in the same way human emotions are? I don't know.
That's a tough one because, I mean, on one hand, I totally see how AI could offer something unique, right? That impartiality thing we talked about, no judgment. But at the same time, there's something very human about wanting that connection to go both ways, to know that the other side, really gets you.
And that's where the conversation needs to keep going, As AI keeps developing, we have to keep asking, what do we want these relationships to look like? What are the ethics involved? And how do we make sure we're using this technology in a way that's actually good for humanity?
So much to think about. It's easy to get lost in all the hypotheticals, you know, the good and the bad. But let's bring it back down to earth for a sec. What does this all mean for, I know, the average person listening right now?
Well, here's something to chew on. As we've been talking about, AI is already all around us, right? Like, it's not some far off thing. It's in the algorithms that decide what you see on social media, the chatbots we use every day. It's already shaping our experiences, whether we realize it or not.
So it's not just about this future where we all have AI companions. It's about recognizing how this stuff is already changing our relationships, our creativity, even our understanding of what it means to be human.
100%. And we all have a role to play in this. As we move forward, it's on all of us to stay informed, to learn about what AI can do, the good and the bad. We got to be curious, but we also got to be critical.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today, from how AI actually works to some pretty deep questions about, consciousness and what it means to connect with something. There's no easy ending to this conversation, but I think that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, it's a conversation that's just going to keep evolving, and we're all part of it now, whether we like it or not.
Truer words have never been spoken. So until next time, keep those questions coming. Keep that curiosity alive, folks, and we'll see you on the next Deep Dive.